Welcome to the Apologetics Guy Show. It's the podcast that helps you find clear answers to tough questions about God, Jesus, and the Bible, and then helps you to be able to turn around and explain your faith with both courage and compassion. If we're just meeting, I'm Dr. Mikel Del Rosario. I'm the host of this podcast, and I'm also a professor of Bible and theology here at the Moody Bible Institute. I want to welcome you to my independent show. And today we're going to talk about unsung apologists, two women who have contributed to Christian apologetics, and most of us have never heard about them before. And the person who brought these two ladies to my attention is my friend Sarah Encherline, who we have here in studio today, coming to us all the way from sunshiny Southern California.
Yes,
thanks so much. Yeah, thanks so much for being here. Last time you were on a Zoom on a remote recording with me, but it's so good to have you in the studio. Thanks for coming all the way to Chicago.
Yes, it's fun. It's a place I've always wanted to visit.
And we brought the hail for you yesterday.
Yes. I was very shocked when I got on the plane in heat and stepped off in snow.
Well, there are a lot of questions. You've been doing apologetics for many years, a lot of questions that are kind of the hot button issues of the day. But no matter what these things are, there's always those timeless questions that every generation has to answer afresh. The problem of evil.
Right.
The existence of God. How do we know we can trust what the Bible says about Jesus? So these kinds of questions, that as we take a look at how the history of apologetics has answered these questions, we find that there are some people we haven't heard about that have actually contributed to these questions.
Right.
And so just tell us briefly about what you do in terms of your apologetics work, and then we'll talk about your research.
So I've been doing lots of different things in apologetics for years, but currently right now, my focus is on historical apologetics. So all the apologetics arguments that have been contributing to the field between about 1600 and 1900. So really that Enlightenment era when deism became popular. So really cataloging apologists and different arguments that came up during that time. How did they answer the skeptics of their day? Specifically, I was tasked with the women of that time, which at the time I would have not guessed there were women doing it at that time. But since then, that's really become kind of my passion project. Is while I still do historical apologetics with everybody, my focus for my personal work is really the women who were doing it at that time.
And you're a staff apologist and a librarian at the Library of Historical Apologetics, right? Tell us about what that is.
So the Library of Historical Apologetics is not a physical library. It is actually an online platform. It's called, it's at historicalapologetics.org. And really what it is we've taken all of the scanned copies of these works by these apologists, like I said, from about 1600 to 1900, anything that's in the public domain post-Renaissance. So we've kind of taken, or post-actually Reformation, and we've taken all of those works and we've scanned them and we have put them online, organized like a library alphabetically so people can find them very easily. And we really just want to make them available to everybody. Like, not everybody can jump on a plane and go to Oxford or Cambridge and do the research and find these works that are hidden in dusty libraries and old universities. So what we're doing is we're trying to make those available to everybody.
And you've written a couple of books on these women who have been really influences in apologetics that most people haven't heard about them. First one was Susanna Newcome, an 18th century philosopher, and it's this book, No Apologies. This book, we actually talked about this book on the very first episode that I ever recorded in Chicago.
Oh, wow.
It was you.
Okay.
Yeah, the very first episode I recorded here in Chicago. But let's talk briefly about how you got interested in studying these women and incorporating history and apologetics together.
Yeah, so I've been doing apologetics a long time, but I also am a history teacher. And so for me, it was just kind of natural for me to try to find connections between the two. I'm just understanding what I know about history and what I know about apologetics and how do those two things complement and support each other as disciplines. And so when I got involved with historical apologetics and I came across Susanna's work, I was just flabbergasted that a woman writing in 1728 would have such a grasp of the arguments that are still being perfected and understood today by the brains of the world. And then as I was studying her, I found 15 other women throughout that kind of time period that I thought, wow, all these other women are writing about these key issues, like you said, that we're still studying today. Like, is Jesus Messiah? What does the Bible say? And can we trust it? Is it reliable? Does God exist? And how do we know that? And so they're talking about all these key issues that we're still arguing about in apologetics today. And so I thought it's important for people to be able to access their works because they had some quality things to say about those arguments. And so Mary Brodrick, actually, the next one happens to be the last one in the series, but I decided to do her next because she fascinated me. And so I wanted to kind of work on her as well. So it's going to be the Heritage of Truth series. And Susanna Newcome came first in history about 1728. And Mary Brodrick is one of the last ones at about 1933.
So you're talking about this book, the second book that you've published. This is called Digging Deeper, The Life and Work of Mary Brodrick.
Right.
But let's talk about Susanna Newcome, and then we'll go to Mary. With Susanna, she's using a kind of classical apologetics model.
Right.
Let's talk about her argument about this grand designer. How did she argue for God as the designer of the universe?
So she actually first started out with this incredible understanding of physics where she basically talked about the unmoved mover. And she basically said, look, if the law of inertia stands, if we can say that if something's moving, someone had to move it in the first place, someone had to be that first step of something happening. She's like, if we believe in physics and things move, then we have to accept that there was a grand mover, right? Or a first mover. And so she starts reasoning. She uses physics first. But then what she does is she says, okay, now if we know that there's a first mover, if we know that there's something that came first, then what would we expect that thing to look like? So then she gives the case for what type of God or deity has to be responsible for the world we can see today. And then that's when she goes into, well, if the world is a grand machine, right? She basically even gets into irreducible complexity and talks about like there's only a certain amount of machines have to have a certain amount of parts in order to work. And she basically says, look, if there's a world like that, then the God that designed that world has to be intelligent. God also has to be personal because that God has to desire a relationship with his creation. And so she basically gives like 10 or 11 different things that this God has to have. And so she basically, like I said, she starts with, well, something started everything. And if so, what was that something? And what does it look like to us?
Yeah. So she's talking about the Kalam cosmological argument, maybe not using those exact same words, but what we know today when we study modern day apologetics really owes a lot to this kind of thought, right?
Yeah.
One thing I really like to point out to my students is that when did she publish this book?
1728.
1728. And she's arguing for God as the designer of this universe, which is like a grand machine, before William Paley has published his Natural Theology in 1802, where he talks about the watchmaker, the more famous illustration, right?
Yes.
So Paley is looking at it kind of on a micro level, like a watch. She's looking at it more on a macro level, like what about the whole universe? If a watch needs a designer, what about all this in the universe?
Right. And she actually is writing, the thing that got my attention was that she's writing about these laws of physics and these Newtonian things, these Newtonian laws of nature within 20 years of Newton publishing them. So she's obviously very well read. She knows the science of her day. And it's even possible that she may have known Isaac Newton because he was a professor of mathematics at the same college where her husband was a professor of divinity. Wow. So she probably had access to his works a lot earlier maybe than the average person did. Maybe she read his papers or maybe took his classes. We don't know how she was exposed to it. We just know that she was applying Newtonian physics to the existence of God as one of the earliest. And so that's why she's fascinating to me.
So interesting. Yeah. Now, just let's talk practicality. You've been a teacher for many, many years. How do you practically use philosophy, these arguments for God's existence that are philosophical arguments, with your students, Christians who are just seeking answers, perhaps skeptics or people of no faith who are looking at the evidence for God?
Honestly, it usually depends on what age I'm teaching and what topic I'm teaching. So usually I try to fit it in where it kind of feels like it naturally is a natural question that would come from the topic. So I use the Socratic method a lot with my students. I ask them these big questions, and we always have an essential question that we focus on. And then that kind of helps them to learn, let's question the world. Let's question why things are the way that they are. And I feel like that's really important because a lot of times kids in colleges or other things are just taught this is what you need to believe and there are no alternatives, right? But I'm teaching my students always question Question everything. It's okay to question as a Christian, as long as you keep questioning and you don't, you don't settle with being skeptical, but that eventually you do come to a point where you are researching and actually trying to find answers. And then the other thing too is that it depends on the topic. So usually if I'm teaching ancient history, I will bring up the idea of the cosmological argument or the argument from design when we talk about the origins of man or the origins of the universe, or where did we come from, but then I get really lucky with the medieval times when I'm teaching that, because then we have the Reformation that we get to teach about. And so a lot of times these questions kind of come up naturally, depending on the topic. But really, I just ask them a question and then we kind of have a discussion from there. So I think one of the biggest things is always leaving opportunity for discussion too, not just filling every moment of your class period with something, but having that opportunity to let kids actually talk through these things with a person who can guide them in the right direction.
About how old?
I was doing this with sixth graders, which is 11-year-olds to about 12th grade, which is seniors in high school.
See, these concepts can get so heady and esoteric that sometimes we think, okay, I just barely grasped and understood all this. How could I possibly bring it down to a junior high level, use it in youth group? But students actually can grasp these things if you're able to share it in such a way that makes sense to them, right?
Right. No, I think that people underestimate kids. I think that they're a lot smarter than we think that they are. I think and the thing is that they're having these questions. They're asking, does God exist? They're asking, is Jesus God? At very young ages. So why shouldn't we encourage that? Why shouldn't we, give them the opportunities to explore those questions and give them the right resources that they can use?
Now, Newcome is kind of a classical apologist, so she uses a two-step method, arguing for the existence of God based on design in the universe, for example. And then she also turns to Jesus and talking about Jesus as the Messiah. Talk about how she kind of answered the religious climate of the day, both with deists and Jewish people pushing up against the gospel.
Yeah. So Susanna, actually, like you said, she starts with basically giving the, case for God. But then once she does give the case for a first cause, then she's like, well, now what does that first cause have to be like in order to have the effects of the world that we have today? What is the cause of the way that the world looks like? And so what she does is she says, okay, there's obviously a first cause. Now, if there's a first cause, what kind of first cause would that be? And now if we know what kind it would be, would that first cause reveal itself to human beings? And if so, in what way would he have done it? And then that's when she segues into Jesus and she says, okay, if he's going to reveal himself to us, this is how he did it. And then she gives the case for Jesus being the revelation of God to man. And so then she goes through and gives the prophetic case for Jesus basically being the Messiah of the Jews. And she basically says, if he's the Messiah of the Jews, then he is the Christ. He is the Savior that we've all been waiting for.
And so she talks about the resurrection as well. Why would the disciples die for a lie?
Yes.
These very similar things as we talk about today.
Yes.
And it's just surprising to so many people that before our modern day apologetics, we already have this kind of argumentation in the 18th century.
Right. And she even gives the case for miracles. And she says, just the evidence that we have eyewitness accounts from that time period that these, just like you said, the disciples would not have lied. They had no motivation to lie. And they really, truly believed they saw these miraculous things happen. And that you can't have a group hallucination. And, she hits on some of these things, like you said, that you're finding as the basic apologetic arguments that you find in textbooks today. Yeah.
Well, so fascinating. Let's turn to the second person that you've studied, Mary Brodrick. Tell us about her and how did you get interested in her?
So Mary Brodrick, I also came across in my historical apologetics work. She is, like I said, is what you would call like an Egyptologist archaeologist. So she was very interested in Egyptology as a kid. She loved Egypt. She was actually a child in England, and someone gave her a book on Egypt as a child, and that kind of sparked this like lifelong interest in that. And then she went to, she tried to study archaeology, but kind of felt like she hit a wall in England. So then she traveled to France, and she actually tried to get into Sorbonne and the University of Paris, but they told her that they don't teach women. And so they said, you're not welcome here. But then she kind of ran into somebody who thought maybe she might have some potential, and he looked in the bylaws, and actually there was nothing against women going there. And so he pushed for her to be able to go there. And so she was actually one of the very first female archaeology students at the Sorbonne in Paris. And she's one of the first that graduated. And so, but the reason I'm fascinated by her, why I chose to do her second, even though she's technically last in the line chronologically, is because as a kid, I always loved movies like Indiana Jones and movies that anything that connected archaeology to the Bible. And so the Last Crusade and the Holy Grail, all of those things I thought, as a kid, I was raised in Sunday school, but I went to public school. And so there was always this disconnect between what I was learning in Sunday school and what I was learning in public school, that they just didn't jive. History had nothing to do with God, right? And God, in Sunday school, I was never taught history. Like no one ever gave me the context of the Bible when I was young. I was super fascinated by the idea that someone could make a real, evidential, rooted in reality connection between those two things. And so when I came across Mary, I thought she was fascinating because that's what she did. She really was an archaeologist that was digging in the dirt and writing articles and speaking on topics that connected the Bible to reality and history. And so I definitely wanted to write about her next just because she was just so fascinating to me.
Yeah. I think some fun things that I discovered is that she was the first woman lecturer in the British Museum.
Yes.
And that she read her Greek New Testament almost every day.
Yes. It was said that she would never be parted from her Greek New Testament. She was a master of languages. I think that gave her a little bit of a boost in a time period where women were not encouraged to learn. And so because of that, I feel like she was able to use that in service to her faith.
Newcome's writing in the 18th century. She's swimming in deism and a lot of that. And Mary Brodrick is in the 20th century now. And we're starting to see this quest for the historical Jesus.
Right.
Where people say, let's get behind the text, behind the Gospels. I wonder what really happened.
Yes.
So they're trying to separate what they call the Jesus of history from the Christ of faith.
Right.
And how did she speak into this this discussion of, can we really trust what the Bible is telling us about Jesus?
Yeah. So one of the things that's interesting, like you were saying, is that Susanna is dealing with the Enlightenment criticisms of deism. And now you've got Mary Brodrick, who coming in on the tail end of the historical critic movement, the historical criticism of the Bible, and the German writers that are trying to discredit the supernaturalism of the Bible and trying to take the miracles out and all that. And one of the most interesting things about Mary is that she grew up in a Christian home and she was always a believer, but her faith was really tested as a student because she was a student of Ernst Renan. And Ernst Renan was, he wrote Das Leben Jesu, which was basically a challenge saying that Jesus was only a man, he was not God.
Can you translate that sentence for those who don't speak German?
Yeah, it's just the life of Jesus.
Yeah.
But so she's got skeptical professors that she's trying to learn from and trying to prove herself to and trying to keep her faith at the same time.
Wow.
And so I think that probably her work came out of a personal quest to maybe bolster her own faith and make sure that the Jesus that she believed in really was the Jesus of the Bible and Jesus of history, and that those things both complemented each other. And so she ends up writing a book which is based on some lectures she gave called The Trial and Crucifixion of Jesus, and Jesus of Nazareth. And so what it is basically she says, yes, he really existed in history. Yes, she uses Josephus and Tacitus and all of those, scholars that we have that are extra biblical sources about Jesus. So she uses those and she says, I'm coming from a purely historical standpoint. I'm not using any of my faith. I'm not trying to get any bias here, but what I'm doing is I'm taking the Jewish law of the time, the Midrash, and all of those different things, like I said, like Tacitus and Josephus, and she's using just those to make the case that Jesus' trial not only happened, but that it was illegal.
Interesting. Well, for those who don't know or haven't heard these names before, Josephus, a first century Jewish historian writing about the Jewish role in Jesus' death, and then Tacitus, another ancient historian, Roman historian, writing about the Roman role in Jesus' death. So the point is these people aren't trying to make the Christian faith look good by confirming the Gospels. They're just writing about history, right? Here's just what happened, right? But now you're talking about the Jewish examination before Caiaphas. This is a scene that I'm very interested in. Did part of my doctoral dissertation research into the scene in Mark 14 there.
Right.
Some people say that there's no way that ever happened, because how could Mark possibly have known, short of saying Jesus rose from the dead and then he came back and told the gospel writers, right? So because there weren't disciples or people who were sympathetic to Jesus, how could we have possibly known? How could Mark have known?
Right.
But just because we don't have the exact source, that we know exactly where Mark got his source, doesn't mean there weren't a whole bunch of different options.
Yes.
So, for example, I think Joseph of Arimathea is a possible option.
100%.
He has access to those records.
Right.
Nicodemus has access to the records. Saul of Tarsus, the Apostle Paul, probably does.
Yeah.
And why do they have to be sympathetic?
Right.
They could be Caiaphas himself and his crew saying Jesus is a blasphemer. Here's what he said.
Yes.
And we see that in Acts, I think, every time Peter is saying Jesus, who, by the way, you guys killed, but he was innocent.
Yeah.
He was, you crucified the Lord of life, but he was innocent.
Yeah.
God raised him from the dead. So I think there was a public discussion about what Jesus said, that he was perceived to have blasphemed by people.
Right. Yeah. And Mary definitely talks about that. There's one whole section in the book where she gives the Jewish law about confession. And she says that a criminal cannot be basically punished based on his own confession. There have to be eyewitnesses that account for what they're saying, that they are in fact blaspheming. But they could not find one person who heard Jesus say he was God that did not see him back it up. And so they couldn't find anyone who basically just heard him say it and had no evidence otherwise. And so what ended up happening, like you were saying, is that you have John. John was with, in the room, and he probably heard what was going on. So we do have John's account. We also have, John was close with Matthew. And so, maybe Matthew got some things from John. And then we also have Peter. Peter wasn't maybe in the room, but he was definitely there in the courtyard. We know he may have talked to, we know that Peter, James, and John definitely had conversations over and over and over again in the book of Acts. It talks about how many times did they come together to meet and clarify doctrine. How do we know that they didn't have those conversations, that they didn't put together a written record that maybe was then shared with people like Mark or Luke or anybody like that. And we do see that there are differences in the accounts, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all have different accounts. But Mary Brodrick actually gives the case for it. That actually is a positive evidence for it, because then that means that they didn't all get in the same room and say, okay, this is what we're going to say and make it up, right? They are all coming from various viewpoints, yet they're all telling the same story, right? And maybe not every single detail is covered in each one, but we know that that's because they all had different purposes, right, for writing their gospels. And so she says that's actually a case for them being accurate, not inaccurate.
That's right. Yeah, we have a mutual friend, J. Warner Wallace, Jim Wallace, who says he's a cold case homicide detective, and if he lines people up, they tell the exact same story verbatim. That's a little sus, as they say.
Right. They're lying.
Clearly, we're going to tell stories different ways. We're going to include some details, and it is actually a test of is this true or not?
Right.
If there's variation. There's gist and variation, but the same core story.
Right.
I studied with Darrell Bach at Dallas Seminary. He wrote a great work on this particular scene called Blasphemy and Exaltation in Judaism. And I love how he handles that there, because I can never get away with calling this a trial in front of him. Because the fact that everything that you were saying, the fact that all these things weren't followed shows that this was not a legit trial, right?
Right.
This is actually more like a grand jury investigation where they're trying to gather evidence that they can take to Pilate to get the death penalty, because they couldn't do it themselves.
Right. And that's actually Mary, that's one of her threads of reasoning is that she goes through, the ancient Jewish law, and she basically says, look, all of these laws were actually broken, but not by Jesus. They were all broken by the Sanhedrin that were trying to, like you said, gather enough evidence to put Jesus on trial. And when they realized that they did not have enough evidence, right, they decided to just use the charge of blasphemy as a way to incite the crowd and then force Pilate in a position of fear to agree to what they're saying. Yeah. And so it was not a true trial, like you said. It's these secret, clandestine, face-to-faces with Annas and Caiaphas, and then just a way to stir up the crowd. And she even talks about that Jewish trial legally cannot start after sundown. It also has to finish before Passover, a legal trial, and that trial would not have finished before Passover if they had done it legally. And so she talks about all the different laws that the Sanhedrin broke in order to get Jesus to the point where he had to admit, yes, I am the Son of God or the Son of Man. And then they used that in order to charge him with blasphemy and then incite a crowd against Pilate.
Yeah, so some kind of meeting had to have happened, whether it was a legit trial or just a meeting to gather evidence. What we can't say is that because they didn't follow these laws, that never happened.
Right.
Or just because we don't know exactly where Mark got his sources, that never happened.
Right.
No, there's plenty of reasons and ways that he could have got that.
I mean, it says the Sanhedrin meeting had to have at least 70 plus people at the trial in order for it to convene. And so we know that there were at least, if not 70, a quorum of 30 plus. And so there are 30 people right there where any of them could have gotten their information from.
Yeah. Can you tell us a story about a time where you used some of what you've learned from Mary or Susanna in terms of talking about the historical Jesus, where people bring up objections about Jesus and how the Bible portrays Jesus?
So Mary definitely, or sorry, not Mary, Susanna actually gives a full case for Jesus being the Messiah. And she does that by using prophecy. And I think for me, prophecy is one of the biggest and best arguments that we have that Jesus was, in fact, who he said he was. There's no way, we know mathematically that he could have fulfilled all of those prophecies. And so when I talk to people and they're like, oh, I don't believe Jesus was God, I always bring up those prophecies. And I say, look, these documents were published, well read, well circulated hundreds of years before Jesus even showed up on the scene. And yet he was able to fulfill all of these different things that there's no possible way mathematically any human could have fulfilled those things. And so it had to be that he was sent from God. So I feel like with Susanna, I use that prophetic argument a lot. And then with Mary, the one that I use is definitely just about the growth of the church and the empty tomb. The church did not stay near the tomb. It actually spread throughout the world. Well, why? Because they knew he was no longer there, right? And he told them after he rose, go therefore into all the world, make disciples. And so I feel like those are probably the two that I use the most.
Talk to us a little bit about the kind of apologetic method that you use most often when you're talking with skeptics, maybe somebody who is from a different world religion or somebody from no faith background. How do you decide? Is there something that you use more often or not?
Actually, no. I kind of use whichever method works at the time. So, with people who don't believe that there's even a God, like maybe an atheist or agnostic, that's when I start with the classical method of, there is a God, and let me tell you the reasons why. But then if I come across somebody who's like, yeah, there's a God, but how do I know which one he is? Or how do I know I can trust the Bible? Then that's where I start working with the evidential way. But then there's also, the idea of sometimes people are at the place in their life where they don't need to hear facts. They don't need to hear, evidence and all that kind of stuff, but maybe they just need to hear your story and they need to hear, how did God change you personally? Right. And then that's where you use that experiential, that narrative, you can tell stories. And so really for me, it honestly depends on where the person's at. So I think that's why it's super important with apologetics is that we understand the whole point of apologetics is not, like I said, to be smart, to acquire a bunch of knowledge, to be the smartest one in the room, right? The point of apologetics is to prepare you for those conversations that you are going to have that are going to lead people to Christ. And, we need to be open to using whichever method is necessary at the time. We need to meet people where they're at, right? We need to make sure that we are asking questions and finding out exactly where they're at. We can't make assumptions, like just finding out, oh, you're a Hindu or you're a Buddhist. Oh, I know exactly what you believe. You really don't. Because people may say they're a Buddhist or people may say they're a Hindu or people may say they're an atheist and you have no idea what they believe.
That's right.
Right. And so it's so important for us to use the Socratic method to ask questions, right? And we need to be willing to listen and understand exactly where they're at so we can answer their concerns, right? We don't want to be trying to convince a Mormon or a Jehovah's Witness or an LDS, Latter-day Saint, that God exists. We don't have to go there with them, right? Because they already believe that. That's not the stumbling block, right? And so we need to make sure that we are meeting people where they're at and understanding what method works best here and not just going into it with our presuppositions saying, well, this is the way that I always do it, so this is how I'm going to do it with this person.
Yeah. For those who aren't familiar with these methods we've been talking about, the classical apologetics method is a two-step where first you argue for the existence of God, then you argue for Christianity as the best version of theism, versus the evidential is you just go straight to, you can talk about the resurrection. You can talk about, I think personally, I always like to go to who is Jesus? That's the question, because I think all apologetic roads lead to Jesus.
100%.
But sometimes these classical and evidential kinds of arguments will come on the backside of your experiential and narratival presentation,
Yes.
your story. C.S. Lewis was a master at this because he could write the Chronicles of Narnia. He could also write Mere Christianity.
Yes.
So he's doing both. He's writing fiction to awaken this desire for there to be true justice and heroism and the beautiful things that we know aren't fully realized in this world that we're searching for and longing for. To get people to want that story to be true and then to show them you can actually believe this. There's actually proof that God exists, that Jesus rose from the dead. There's evidence for us to look at.
Right. And I think the argument from desire really is a good launching off point with anybody, because I think everybody can relate to the idea of, well, why do we find things beautiful? Why are we attracted to art? Why does religion exist? Right? Those are kind of big questions that no matter which worldview anybody is in, they can engage in those types of ideas. And so if you don't even know where to start, you don't know where someone believes, and you have to be the one to talk, those are some good questions to focus on. Well, why do we find things beautiful? Why are we attracted to beauty, right? Why do we like art, right? So those kinds of things, I think, are things that everybody, and C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, that people like that, they understood that. They understood that was a way to open the door to a bigger conversation.
How do you see the way apologetics was done back in their day, in the 18th, 19th, 20th century, early 20th century, versus where we are today in terms of for people who want to go into apologetics now, for college students, grad students who want to study apologetics? Maybe they're being inspired by reading about these great apologists of old and discovering new ones. What's your best advice to them?
I would say the questions that humans have not changed. Right? The questions that humans had back then are the same questions that humans have now. So we're still arguing with people over, did Jesus exist? We're still arguing with people over, is the Bible the Word of God? We're still arguing over, is there a God? If so, what kind of God is it? Did he reveal himself to humankind? And I think because of that, I think that really the principles are largely the same, is study as much as you can. Don't get overburdened and try to learn everything, right? Definitely pick some things that you are fascinated by and maybe focus on those, but get a good enough foundation, kind of a basic understanding of the basic principles of apologetics. Then you need to start really also thinking about evangelism tactics. So I think Greg Koukl's Tactics is a great jumping off point, where he talks about, he even says, listen, ask questions, and so I feel like if you want to be an apologist, always have at the forefront of your mind, what is the purpose of this? Am I doing it to just be smart and be, have a scholarly reputation, or am I doing it in order to further God's kingdom? And I think to always have that in the forefront of your mind. Why are you doing this? Because, you and I both love apologetics and we write this, but our ultimate goal is to bring people to Christ. If that's not your heart, if that's not how you feel, you're going to get burnt out, because you're going to get frustrated with the fact that you cannot learn and know every single thing that you're going to want to learn. And so I would definitely say always have the right motivation, and then specialize. Pick something that you're interested in and focus on that, so that you are not overburdened by trying to know everything.
Yeah. I always tell my students in my apologetics classes, first of all, learn all you can, because you never know when you think, when are we ever going to use this particular argument or this fact?
Yes. Be a sponge.
Yeah. I remember one time I was a teacher, and the lady next to me was an English teacher, and she brought a niece of hers who was an atheist teenage girl, and she just wanted to talk to me at this field day that we had. And she just kind of talked to me the entire field day. Wow. All kinds of questions. We talked about, what is faith?
Right.
Is there evidence for God? Is there evidence for the resurrection?
Yeah.
And at the end of that conversation, first of all, I was like, wow, everything I learned in my Master of Arts in Apologetics at Biola, it just kind of like all got used right there. Yeah. It was amazing. But she didn't come to faith right then. She just thought, I've never heard Christians have reasons and speak intelligently about this. It was nice to meet you,
Yeah.
And then I found out later, 2 weeks later, she gives her life to the Lord at a church.
That's amazing.
Sometimes we get those little glimpses where God shows us, hey, I used you right there.
Right. This is
I was able to.
Yes. This is why I chose you to do this.
Yeah. I took the things that you learned, and you had an opportunity. You saw that opportunity, and God was faithful to speak through us.
Yeah. I think that's why it's important for us to remember the parable of the sower. Some of us are going to throw seeds. We're going to throw seeds. And sometimes they're going to land on rocky soil. Sometimes they're going to land on fertile soil. It really all depends on where the person's at and where their heart is. And I think it's important for us not to get discouraged if we don't give someone an apologetic argument and they don't immediately, come to faith because we were so eloquent in what we said. But we need to, understand that we're there to plant seeds, and we're and sometimes we sow, sometimes we don't, right? But God is the one who gives the increase. But we just always need to be ready, like 1 Peter 3:15, always be ready to give an answer, because that's when you're giving you're planting those seeds. And then you never know what God is going to do with them. And I think it's important not to get discouraged, but also to, like you were saying, learn as much as you can, because you never know when the Holy Spirit is going to pull it out of you in a random conversation, because the Holy Spirit will do that. He will bring to remembrance the things that you have studied. But like, what is it? 2 Timothy 2:15, be diligent to study, right? It's important. Be like the Bereans, check everything, make sure that everything that you're hearing is accurate. But definitely, put the time in, get the education, read the books, watch the videos, listen to the podcasts, right? Because you never know when God is going to bring someone into your life that has that particular question.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Another thing I talk about in class a lot, in apologetics class here, is ministry and the use of apologetics in ministry. And ministry means service.
Right.
So if we see apologetics as ministry, how do we serve the other person through our discussion? We're not just trying to gain intellectual points, we're not in debate mode.
Yeah, we're not trying to win.
That's right. You're not really trying to win anything.
Right.
You're trying to help them to consider another way to look at life.
Right.
Sometimes that takes a lot of work just to get somebody.
Yeah.
You're not going to take someone from an atheist perspective to Christianity in one conversation.
Right.
But persuasion can happen incrementally. And so we just need to be okay with that, because if the Lord uses you in this little way, that's great.
Yeah. I always tell people, like, if you're getting into apologetics to win debates, if you're trying to be a debate winner, that's not the right motivation. I say we're not debate winners, we're bridge builders. We're building a bridge between that person's worldview and our worldview, and we're trying to show them the benefits of our worldview, and trying to show them, whether they've walked away in their faith, the value of coming back, or whether they're not a believer at all, the value of Christianity and how it does satisfy. It is the answer to every desire that you have, right? And so, so it's important that we have the skills and the knowledge in order to build that bridge between us.
I think back to Susanna and Mary, they had so many obstacles, that not only because they were women, but also because they were writing about Jesus, speaking out against the culture that pushes back on the gospel. We do the same thing today in a different context, but we can get discouraged, we can get frustrated, but we always need to be aware that there's always going to be that pushback. It comes with the territory.
Right.
But just to be faithful and to be an ambassador. It's not on us to convert people, but just to be faithful witnesses, and God's going to use you. Yeah.
I mean, I can't imagine, Susanna finding out that after she died, no one read her work for 200 years.
Wow.
You know what I mean? Like, can you imagine, finding out that, once I died, I became, obsolete, and my arguments, weren't read by anybody until, 200-300 years later. And then now all of a sudden they have value again. I mean, can you imagine hearing that? And then you'd be so discouraged, but that's not why she wrote. She didn't write to be famous. Obviously, she wrote anonymously. So that wasn't her purpose, right? She was just trying to put out into the world an explanation for why Christianity is valuable.
Yeah.
And so that's actually one of the reasons I'm so passionate about bringing them to light, because they do have these valuable arguments, and they will help us and assist us in that goal of bringing people to Christ.
What would you specifically say to women who are listening, who feel the Lord leading them into an apologetics ministry?
I would say, first of all, don't be discouraged if people tell you that's not for you, because that happened to me a lot. I would say take every opportunity that comes your way. I was blessed to have mentors who gave me opportunities, and I wasn't always the best speaker in the room. I wasn't always the most, eloquent. Like, I called myself a Moses in an Aaron world, because I always felt like I struggled with speaking, and so there were a lot of things that I felt like I didn't belong in the room all the time. And so I would just say, if you ever get that feeling, know that God created you the way that you are. He wouldn't give you that desire and that brain to not be used. And so I would say, I would just encourage you in your gifts, and try to find surround yourself with people who are going to encourage you in those gifts, and not people who are going to tell you shouldn't be doing that. And then like we were saying, study. Right? Learn evangelism tactics. Learn as much as you can, read as much as you can, and just don't let anybody tell you that apologetics isn't for women, because it is.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for being with us today.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. It's been awesome.
And we thank you so much for joining us here on the Apologetics Guys show as well. If you found this beneficial to you and helpful, please do help us out by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. It really does help people find out more about what we're doing here, and it does support the show. Or you can drop a comment on the YouTube side. If you're watching the video, please drop a comment below so that more people can see what we're doing here. Thanks again for watching and being a part of our hashtag First Friday here on the Apologetics Guys show. I'm your apologetics guy, Dr. Mikel Del Rosario, and until next time, keep the faith.